2 Chronicles chapter 13, verses 12 through 22. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. So you see, God is with us. He is our leader. His priests blow their trumpets and lead us into battle against you. O people of Israel, do not fight against the Lord, the God of your ancestors, for you will not succeed. Meanwhile, Jeroboam had secretly sent part of the army around behind the men of Judah to ambush them. When Judah realized that they were being attacked from the front and the rear, they cried out to the Lord for help. Then the priests blew the trumpets, and the men of Judah began to shout. At the sound of their battle cry, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel and routed them before Abijah and the army of Judah. I just want to come before you briefly on the topic of surrounded on all sides. Surrounded on all sides. You see, when you read the Bible and you study the history of both kingdoms, you see a litany of ineffective, disobedient, even corrupt kings. You see, when the Hebrews first asked for a king in the book of Judges, they were told that God was their king. As they approached the prophet Samuel, he told them that their desire for a king is actually an act of disobedience. And he warned them that they would pay dearly if they established a monarchy. But they insisted, and God allowed them to appoint Saul as king. And Saul, he started off good, but he ended up being one of the evil kings. And after Saul, then David was appointed king. And David started off a good king. He had some issues along the way, but he still ended on a good note. And after David died, his son Solomon then became king. And Solomon started off good, but he was another one that ended evil. And his disobedience is what caused the kingdom to be divided. Now, after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam, he became king. Now, he started evil, ended evil, and then after him, his son Abijah. Now, when Solomon passed and Rehoboam, he became king, and then there was another king that was established in the north of Jeroboam, and we'll go into those details just shortly. But you may ask yourself, well, what was this great sin that Solomon committed that caused the kingdom to be divided? Turn with me, if you would, to 1 Kings chapter 11. We'll begin reading at verse 1. That's 1 Kings chapter 11. We'll begin reading at verse 1. I'll be reading from the the New Living Translation. It reads, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, and in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshiped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. On the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, he even built a pagan shrine for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and another for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Solomon built such shrines for all his foreign wives to use for burning incense, sacrificing to their gods. The Lord was very angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had warned Solomon specifically about worshiping other gods, but Solomon did not listen to the Lord's command. So now the Lord said to him, since you have not kept my covenant and have disobeyed my decrees, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do this while you are still alive. I will take the kingdom from your son. And even so, I will not take away the entire kingdom. I will let him be king of one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, my chosen city. You see, God had laws that prohibited marrying foreign women. God had laws that prohibited marrying foreigners. Now, if you look at Exodus chapter 34:16, it reads, then you will accept their daughters who sacrifice to other gods as wives for your sons, and they will seduce your sons to commit adultery against me by worshiping other gods. See, God had a reason. He didn't just arbitrarily pick things and say, don't do this, don't do that. No, he had a reason for telling these people, do not do this, because if you do this, this will be the outcome. You see, look in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. It says, you must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. See, being unequally yoked to these unbelievers or unequally yoked to people that worship other gods would cause the children of Israel, God's people, to, for some reason, accept their practices. It would take their hearts away from the true and living God into idolatry, worshiping the creature instead of the creator. So Solomon's disobedience led to the division of the kingdom. Now, Solomon had a servant, Jeroboam. He was a skillful administrator. He had appointed him, he had given him a job, given him a task, and one day this Jeroboam, he's going out trying to, just do his job, and Ahijah, the prophet, grabbed him, tore off a piece of his cloak, tore it up into 12 pieces, gave him 10 of them. And he told him, he said, listen, this is what God's about to do. Tear the kingdom away from David's dynasty, and he's going to give you 10 of the 12 tribes. Now, Solomon heard this, and Solomon said, this can't be. I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam, he flees, he goes down to Egypt, and he's there for the duration of Rehoboam's life. Now, Rehoboam's son, Abijah, now becomes king. Now, when he's king, when he succeeds, almost instantly, Jeroboam, he wants to come and start a war. But before that, let me not get ahead of myself. What happened was, he's appointed, Abijah, he's appointed king in the south. He goes up to the north to let them know, hey, I'm going to be king in the north. And the leaders of the north, they said, listen, we'll accept you as our king and we'll be your loyal subjects, but you have to lighten the load. Your father was a hard taskmaster, and we'll follow you, but you just got to back off a little bit. Lighten the load on us some. And he said, okay, well, give me a few days to think about this thing. So he goes and he consults. He goes down and he talks to the senior advisors, the older men. And he's like, what should I do? And the older men said, listen, man, if you just hear them out and you lighten their load a little bit, these people, they'll appoint you king and they'll be your loyal subjects. And he's all right, okay, that sounds good. But I'm going to go to my boys and I'm going to see what my boys have to say. So now he goes to the younger advisors and he tells them what they said. He was like, what should I do? They're like, bruh, man, if you do that, they don't think you soft, and you got to be hard. So he's like, you know what, I'm going to listen to these young advisors, because I don't want to come off looking soft. I want them to know that I have the power. So he comes back to them, and he said, if you think my father was tough, you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm going to be even more hard on you than my father was. Now, when they heard this, the people from the north, they said, 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16, when all Israel realized that the king had refused to listen to them, they responded, down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look out for your own house, O David. So the people of Israel returned home. Listen, they were not having it. They were not having it. So much so, when Abijah sends one of his officers, one of his officials out to restore order, they stone him to death. The kingdom's now divided, and the people in the north, they make Jeroboam king of the north. Now, once Abijah is in place, Jeroboam, he wants to come and he wants to start a war. So now the king of the north on one side, the king of the south on the other side, they meet before battle, and Abijah begins to tell them, listen, you all have come against us with a great multitude. You see, they outnumbered them. 800,000 with the north, only 400,000 in the south. You all have come with us with a great number, but what you don't understand is you all have forsaken Jehovah. You've forsaken Jehovah. You're worshiping golden calves. You've even driven out the Levites. You've driven out the priests. You've driven out the divine order, and you've allowed anyone that wanted to be a priest, you let them be the priest. You know, just like we know, that the word said that God gave the kingdom to David and his sons, and that they should rule over them forever. And he said, God is on our side. In essence, he was telling them, y'all know better than that. God is on our side, so don't even try this. But in the middle of his speech, Jeroboam, he was trying to be a tactical military leader, and he's there listening attentively to the speech, and at the same time, he's sending a portion of his army to go behind them and attack them or ambush them from the rear. About the time that Abijah realizes that he's attacked from the rear, he came to his senses. But look at something. When you look at these 12 tribes that are now at war against each other, these are the people that from Abraham, he had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He had 12 sons. His 12 sons, at the time of famine, they went into Egypt. They multiplied, became 12 tribes. So these 12 tribes is actually a family. This is one family that's actually at war. What you may refer to as a family feud. It's interesting because even as we look at our lives today and we see ourselves at war with an enemy that's the same as us. You see, right now, everybody is aware, most of us are aware of this racial injustice and these tumultuous times that they're in, very volatile. And while we're witnessing this, it's easy to just focus on black against white or black against colored people or what have you. But if you strip it all back, we all bleed the same blood. We're all derived from Adam and Eve. We're all part of the human race. We're family, but we're at war. Just like when Abijah came against Jeroboam, the first thing that he began to tell him is, you all have forsaken God, Jehovah. You're worshiping idols. It's very interesting as we even look at this, that in the middle of this racial tension, we even have churches that are at odds with one another. We're all supposed to be serving the same God. I'm talking about just in Christianity. We're supposed to be serving the same God, but there's a white church against black churches. And this is the time of, they say Sunday mornings are one of the most segregated times, separated times, because the people at this church don't want to intermingle with the people at that church. And, you know, if you even take it a step further, it's not just a white against black thing, because you can see people from different countries. You can all be black, but if you're from the north, you might not be in agreement with the people from the south. Or if you're from this country or that continent, we can't, for some reason, that there's tension all around us. We're supposed to be one family, but we're at odds. We're fighting. We're supposed to be all God's children, but we've been at war for hundreds of years. Now, they were surrounded. Abijah was surrounded. He was surrounded. You know, I was thinking when God kind of started giving me this word bit by bit a few weeks ago, and he was, at the time, he was just dealing with me on being surrounded. This was before the racial tension had exploded as it did. We were still dealing with the pandemic. And while we were dealing with this global pandemic, we were focused on something that had shut the world down. Most of us have never seen anything like this in our lifetime, where every country in this world was shut down. No one was going to work. Everyone was confined to their homes. We were quarantined, and we were watching the statistics of how many people were infected, and we were looking at the curve go up and down, and what was the rate of death, and who was recovering. And just as we were beginning to flatten the curve, and the governors and presidents and the different leaders were beginning to open up cities and what have you, just as things were beginning to break, then all of a sudden, racial injustice took center stage. One enemy here, another enemy there, surrounded. And if you look at some of the numbers, it seems like everything that we're up against impacts the African American or the black man at a greater rate. What do you mean, preacher? The NPR.com said nearly 23% of reported COVID deaths in the United States are African American. Mind you, in the United States, the African American, the black man, only makes up 13% of the population, 13. But yet we made up 23% of the COVID deaths. When you look at the incarceration rate, again, only make up 13% of the population in America, but the black male accounts for 37% of the total male prison population. Disproportionate. Only 30% of the population, only 13% of the U.S. population, but 37% of the incarcerated male population. But even beyond that, from 2015 to 2019, black people accounted for 26% of the people that were killed by police. Wherever you look, this small percentage of the population, just in this country alone, we're disproportionately impacted, affected by the things that are in front of us, behind us, all around us. But as God was taking me through this text, he wanted me to focus on one thing. He said, what did Abijah do when he was surrounded? What did Abijah do when he was surrounded on all sides. The text said he cried out to the Lord for help. Simply, he just cried out to the Lord. You see, in the text, it kept saying Judah. It was saying Judah against Jeroboam. See, Judah, we understand that as praise. They understood that I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praises will continually be in my mouth. They understood that from the rising of the sun to the going down. They all magnified. They understood praise. They understood worship. But at this particular time, their praise went up a notch. It went from praise to a battle cry. It went just from worship, not just, but it went from worship. It went from praise to a battle cry. Psalms 61 verse 1 says, hear my cry, O God, and attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from my enemies. Psalms 34:6 said, this poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his trouble. When God hears your cry, he will deliver you. When you cry out to God, he will hear you. When you cry out to God, he will hear you and deliver you from all your troubles. See, there's power in crying out. It shows that you are relying on God in desperate times. It shows that you're relying on God in desperate times. Throughout history, believers have cried out to God in times of distress. Sometimes after years of praying, fasting, and just going before the Lord, seeking the Lord, a simple cry for help can turn the tides. It can turn the direction. It can bring deliverance. A cry. Many have wondered why there's so much power that results from crying. See, the promise is clear. Psalms 51:15 says, call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver thee. And thou shalt glorify me. It's a promise. Call upon him in the day of trouble. He will deliver. Throughout scriptures, believers are instructed to cry out to God in times of trouble. Jeremiah 33:3 says, call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things, which thou knowest not. Psalms 34:17, the righteous cry, and the Lord hears him and delivers him out of all his troubles. Psalms 56:9, when I cry unto thee, then shall my enemies turn back. This I know, for God is with me. Come on. If we could just get to the place where we elevate it from a place of praise and elevate from a place of worship and get to a point where it's a battle cry, where we're crying out to the Lord in distress because we know that we can't do it in and of ourselves. That God, I need you. Oh, I need you. I can't do this. Come save me. In my distress, I called upon you. So what are the characteristics of a cry? You see, crying out to God, it's an act of desperation. Act of desperation. Is anybody desperate for something? It's an act of desperation, total concentration, fervent passion, expression of faith to God. It's an expression of trust. I'm trusting in his goodness and power to act on my behalf. You see, crying out to God expresses genuine humility. See, the word said, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. It's unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender. Because we know that if we regard iniquity in our heart, the Lord won't even hear you. So we have to surrender unconditionally for the cry to even be heard. It's a plea for mercy. Yes, The cry expresses humility, unconditional surrender, a plea for mercy, personal helplessness, faith in God's power and resources, and desperation. Somebody say desperation, 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 desperation. Psalms 18:6 said, in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even unto his ears. Cry out to the Lord in your distress, in your distress, in your distress. When your heart is overwhelmed, cry out to the Lord. His word said he will hear you and he will deliver you. Some examples: Elijah cried out, God revived a dead child. Jehoshaphat cried out, God delivered him from death. Hezekiah cried out, God gave him victory. Blind Bartimaeus cried out, and Jesus restored his sight. The disciples cried out in a storm, and Jesus calmed the storm. Is anybody in a storm? Is anybody blind? Does anybody need deliverance? Just cry out to God with a voice of triumph. You know, what's interesting, when I look at this, I ask myself, it doesn't make sense that just crying out to God would produce such results. It can even seem like crying out, it doesn't even make sense to do. Because even especially us men, we're taught and we're trained from a very early age, don't cry. Don't cry out. Don't ask for help. But this seems so counterintuitive, but the Word of God, and that's why I'm glad that I'm allowing this Word to change even what's been programmed into me. I'm allowing, when I read the Word and I chew on it and I digest it, if there was something, if there was a belief system that I've been carrying, if it doesn't line up with the Word, then I've got to do away with that old belief, and I've got to conform to this image, to this Word that I'm taking to me, because I can continue to do what I've been doing and continue to get what I've been getting. But the Word tells me, don't just be a hard man, but when I find myself in distress, cry out to the Lord in the day of trouble, and he will deliver me. Cry out to God. He will deliver me. He will deliver me. Psalms 145:19. God will fulfill the desire of them that fear him. He will also hear their cry and will save them. God will fulfill the desires of them that fear him. He will also hear their cry and he will save them. When you look at this and you start trying to line up these scriptures, it's easy to say, well, God, I've been crying out to you, but I don't see anything happening. My grandparents, my great-grandparents have been crying out to you, and we don't see anything happening. I've been praying for this thing that I've been dealing with for years, for decades, God, and I don't see anything happening. Then God just tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, I said I'd deliver you, but I didn't say when. God, what are you saying? God took me to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He said, I would put enmity between thee and the woman, he's talking to the serpent, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. This is the foretelling, or this is the earliest revelation of the coming Messiah and how he was going to dominate Satan. Look, this is in Genesis. Later on in Isaiah, we see For unto us a child is born, this is prophetically speaking. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Now, here, Jesus is being progressively revealed in Scripture throughout the Old Testament. When you look at the span of time in the Old Testament, that was over 4,000 years. 4,000 years passed from Genesis to Malachi, and Jesus didn't come. But then there was this period between Malachi and Matthew where many say there was silence. God wasn't speaking. There are no books in our canon written that were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So you have this span of 400 years where although the people had been crying out, nothing was happening for 400 years. And you see, there was a shift taking place. And it's something about that 400-year time span that we needed that time to elapse for the birthing process to take place. What are you saying? When these children of Israel were going into bondage, it was prophesied in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. So the children of Israel, they go into bondage. For 400 years, they're waiting on a deliverer. 400 years pass before Moses comes, lets my people go, they have the Exodus experience. We move on. Then at the end of Malachi, from Malachi to Matthew, there's a period of 400 years. And God, he said, just look at something. God said, the first documented slaves in this country came in 1619. 1619 to 2019 is 400 years. 1619 to 2019 is exactly 400 years. It was something about when 2020, the year 2020 hit, and everybody was preaching about having perfect vision, but nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw that this was going to be a shifting in time. You see, not just the pandemic, not just racial injustice, it seemed like everything was coming in and closing in on us all at the same time. God's people have been crying out to him for 400 years. We've been waiting for deliverance. We've been waiting for a change, transformation. But we preached just a few weeks ago that just like in the pregnancy and the birthing process, the closer you get to delivery, the closer you get to your deliverance, the closer you get to your blessing, the greater the pain. It's like the whole earth right now is groaning, travailing, because God is in the midst of doing something. What I also understand is right at that point when that baby is coming through, that's when both lives are in the balance. Right when the baby is coming out of the womb and coming into this world, in the midst of that transportation, the wife, the mother, her life is in the balance. The baby's life is in the balance. We as a people must be careful, even in our protesting, even in our commentary, what we say and what we do. We can be angry, but don't sin. Don't go looting. Don't go staring. We know that we have to still abide by the laws, because what God is trying to do, we can cause a breach in the birth. We can do something that can cause everything to go awry. Be careful. Be be careful. God is in control. I know we want to help him, and I know we want to march and we want to protest, and it's fine. Do all that, but be peaceful, be respected. But don't get in God's way. God is in the middle of doing something. We had to be at home. If everybody would have been going to work and going to the ball games and going to church, and we would have been caught up so much in everything that we've been doing, that this would have just been another passing story. Just like Trayvon and just like so many of the others, that there have been many deaths leading up to this. There's been a lot of police shootings, and they didn't bring the world to this point, but just by one death at the right time caused the whole world to come together. You look at the news now, not just in this city, not just in this country, but all across the world. London, Paris, Australia, so many other countries, you're seeing white people, black people joining hands, Asians, Indians, so many people joining hands. Black Lives Matter, no more racial injustice. We're coming together. I've never seen anything like this in my life. But God is bringing these people together as a result of a unified voice. You're seeing company CEOs. You're seeing heads of sports organizations, different commissioners. You're seeing people all over the land, even in government. Now there is a singular voice of racial justice. There's a singular voice of peace that I've never heard. Even the evangelicals that once stood with Trump and supported everything he said, regardless of how ludicrous it was, now they're even slapping him on the wrist. You shouldn't say that. You shouldn't do it. This was insensitive. There's been a shift. God knows exactly what he's doing. We've been surrounded for 400 years. The enemy's been coming in. We've been crying out for 400 years, but God is delivering his people. I want to encourage us, each and every one of us, that just continue to praise, continue to worship the Most High, continue to cry out in our distress. God said he will hear us. He is in the process of deliverance right now. Can't you see it? God is moving. God is moving. In my distress, I cry. Out of the depths of my soul, I cry. And God heard me from his holy hill. And he's come to deliver us.